Hey guys, Comic Boom here to once again talk Wonder Woman 1984. I already did an interview with my buddy Spike Valentine where we talked about Wonder Woman 1984. And I wanted to do another quick synopsis about some of the flaws and faults that I did find in the movie. The reality is that when I first watched Wonder Woman 1984, it was a feel-good movie and emotionally it resonated with me, but it does have some flaws and I wanted to talk about those because I would encourage people to watch my interview with Spike Valentine and how when we talked about the movie. For the most part, we liked it. It had some emotional gravitas, and it worked. I think it worked on an emotional level in terms of catering to the higher aspects of certain elements of Wonder Woman's mythology, particularly the care ethics, the kindness, the compassion, and the ability through the magic lasso to help people choose the truth, to compel the truth and have them see certain truths that otherwise their desires and their greed and the lower aspects of our nature would force us to maybe make choices that we otherwise wouldn't. And in that level, I think it worked. But as a superhero movie, it did have its flaws, and I wanted to talk about them. And this is basically my top 10 of what didn't work in Wonder Woman 1984, or did it? Because the jury might still be out for some people, because I think this is actually a fairly divisive film. Now, in no particular order, I want to talk about what arguably didn't work in Wonder Woman 1984. And I'm going to start with number 10 here. The theme is repeated from the first movie. One of the interesting aspects of Wonder Woman 1984, and I want to be clear here that there are spoilers, obviously. One of the things that's obvious in Wonder Woman 1984 is that the villain is the same. And that the villain is in fact mankind. In the first movie, Ares represented mankind, and Ares was the villain. He embodied evil. Wonder Woman entered man's world during World War I, and she ultimately thought that if she defeated Ares, that all would be well, evil would be removed from mankind, but discovered, of course, that you can destroy Ares, but you're not going to destroy and remove evil from mankind, because mankind chooses whether to be good or whether to be bad. And what really facilitated World War I was mankind choosing to go to war against each other, go to war against itself. And ultimately, the defeat of Ares is not going to defeat evil. Now, similarly, in this movie, mankind is also indirectly the villain in this movie. And that's epitomized through Maxwell Lord. Maxwell Lord in Wonder Woman 1984 acquires a wish stone, a wishing stone that grants your wishes. And in return for your wish being granted, the stone exacts a price from you. You've got to give something up. You want to give up, you have to give up what you value the most in order to be granted your most precious wish. And of course, mankind, or humanity, not just men, but of course all of humanity in Wonder Woman 1984, they all ultimately end up making a wish, but it all comes at a price. And the price ultimately paid, unless something else is done and unless they renounce that wish, is literally the destruction of civilization itself. And so I thought that was interesting that the themes were unified, and at the same time, that may or may not be seen as a good thing. I put it as potentially a negative here, and why it may not have worked, because it was once again making humanity itself sort of the bad guy, when maybe the theme should have been different. Maybe they should have had a completely different story. Maybe this whole story didn't work for you. And I completely respect that and understand that. But it is worth noting that the theme is similar. Now, one of the things that, and going to number 9 now, what didn't work in Wonder Woman 1984 was arguably the stone itself. Now, this is, I'm being a little harsh, and probably overly harsh, because for the most part, I thought this movie worked enough for me that I enjoyed it. But there's a focus, whenever there was a focus on the characters in the movie, sometimes it would break down, it would work for the most part when it focused on the characters, but less so when it focused on the wishing stone itself. Now, the characters that really came through very well were obviously Diana and Steve Trevor. Steve Trevor, played by Chris Pine, he really carried this film. He really did, and you really know why he had to be in this film. Gal Gadot's acting, it did improve in this movie. I thought Gal Gadot's acting in the third act, which required a lot of emotional scenes from her, in particular the scene where she has to renounce her wish and ultimately say goodbye to Steve Trevor for a final time before running off, gaining back her powers, catching the wind, literally, and going off to win the day to face Cheetah and Maxwell Lord. That, for the most part, I think that worked. Those emotional moments, those character moments, I thought often worked well. Those were the strengths of this movie. But whenever it focused on the wishing stone itself, that's where some of the things started to break down a little bit. And I think a lot of the complaints are about, what were the rules of the stone? For example, Maxwell Lord, at first it was a little bit unclear. Maxwell Lord, his wish was that he wanted to become the wishing stone itself. So early on in the movie, when Diana, holding the stone, is reflecting on Steve Trevor and wishes he was back, she doesn't realize that this is actually a wishing stone. And so Wonder Woman inadvertently wished Steve Trevor back. She didn't realize what she was doing. And so the price that the stone exacted on Wonder Woman was the loss of her powers. Now, when Maxwell Lord wished to be the wishing stone itself, and when he became the wishing stone, the living embodiment of the wishing stone, then he got to decide what the price to be paid was. If he could grant your wish, but he decided what the price you pay would be, and he did that when the president wished for more nuclear weapons. Of course, the price that was paid was that Maxwell Lord wanted the president's power. He wanted all the influence that the president had, and he was given that back in return. But there were some inconsistencies there, and some things don't always work. At the end, when people were renouncing their wish, did everybody renounce their wish? That seems a little bit odd. What if you were, for example, an example that has been talked about, what if you were a parent with a dying child, with a terminally ill child, and you wish for them to be saved? Would you renounce that wish? Of course not. Of course not. You wouldn't do that. And yet at the end, it implied that everybody in the world renounced their wish, even though the cheetah never renounced her wish specifically. But then at the end, it didn't really matter that the whole world renounced their wishes, because when Maxwell Lord renounced his wish, which was to become the wishing stone, that got rid of all the wishes anyway. So that sort of took away from the plot and the weight of the whole idea of the world renouncing their wish. So the plot gravitas and the emotional gravitas leading to the end arguably was taken away by the fact that it could all be undone simply by Maxwell Lord undoing everything by renouncing his wish. It took away the impact of all the citizens of the world renouncing their wish. But again, I can still go with it, but I think I sort of lost something there, and I think there were elements of how the stone worked that were a little bit confusing and maybe didn't quite jive, and perhaps lack some verisimilitude within the context of the movie itself. Now, number 8 is interesting. Max Lord's telekinesis. This is something that was sort of out of the blue, and this didn't quite jive with me. At the end, when Maxwell Lord is broadcasting himself to the world, and Wonder Woman has her magic lasso attached to Maxwell Lord, and somehow through the broadcast waves, they asked you to believe that somehow the magic lasso always can only work if it's touching somebody. It can only compel truth or impact truth if it's touching someone. And the concept in this movie was that broadcast particles, broadcast waves, through this 1980s technology, you could touch people. So technically the magic lasso was touching people through Maxwell Lord and through the broadcast waves being shot around the planet. That was a little bit off. So I know it's comic book science, but when we know something is definitely not the way it works in our world when it comes to broadcast waves don't actually touch us in the conventional sense that we think of the magic lasso having to touch us. It doesn't quite work, but you needed to believe that in order for Wonder Woman's magic lasso to touch the world and for her message to be heard when she spoke to them. Similarly, and related to that is Maxwell Lord somehow gained telekinesis. But that doesn't make any sense. How could Maxwell Lord never wished for telekinesis. and nobody else wished Maxwell Lord to get telekinesis. For example, throughout the movie, Maxwell Lord could get other people to make wishes that would better and make his life better. He could get other people to wish him better health. So even though the cost that Maxwell Lord paid for his wish was his health kept getting impacted, he could always fix that by having somebody else wish him to get better. And so the wishes compounded itself and compounded one off the other. But it was never explained how he could suddenly gain telekinesis and communicate with everybody through the broadcast waves on the planet. But you needed to believe that because Maxwell Lord needed to communicate with each other through his telekinesis in order for Wonder Woman to communicate with them through the lasso through Max Lord. So that itself never quite worked. But again, kudos to Patty Jenkins that even though that was off, the emotions of that moment, the emotions conveyed in that third act, didn't really have me focus too much on the why and the how. And that's the credit, I guess, to Patty Jenkins. But again, as a comic book movie, and this relates to my third criticism at number 3, what worked had little to do with the comic book movie. What worked in this movie was the character moments and the emotions. But that could have worked in any movie. This is still a comic book movie, and because it's still a comic book movie, you still need to have those comic book moments. You still need to have, even if it's comic book science and fantastical science and crazy and zany plots, it still has to work as a comic book movie. You can't forget that you're still dealing with a superhero. You're still dealing with Wonder Woman, who's got fantastical powers. And you still need to have elements of a comic book movie. And I say this because I know Patty Jenkins has been on record saying that she never really was a huge fan of the third act of the first Wonder Woman movie, and that was sort of studio pushed, that third act with Ares and the big battle. And a lot of the criticisms of the first Wonder Woman movie, a lot of it did comment on the third act as being too Snyder-like, Zack Snyder-like, with all its darkness and the battle, etc., etc. But the fact of the matter is that there were ways to improve on that third act. Patty Jenkins' idea here in this movie, in her third act, she moved away from comic book action, focused more on those character moments. And while that worked as a character moment, it took away from what is essential for a comic book movie, and that is you do need to have that comic book action. So I can completely see the criticisms that people had, that it needed to have more action. It needed to have, I would suggest, a better balance between those emotional, character-driven moments with more action and more at stake with respect to the comic book action. Now, continuing on. This movie, coming in at number 7, this movie also gave Wonder Woman new powers. And I got to tell you, this was a little bit jarring at first. Wonder Woman's invisible jet becomes invisible because Wonder Woman remembers her father Zeus, or learning how to change things invisible herself. And apparently it's a power she got from Zeus. And that's all well and good, but she just says this out of the blue. I mean, they get in this plane. Suddenly Steve Trevor, who's a World War I pilot, remember, suddenly he knows how to fly a modern day jet. That was a little bit off, but I'll go with it. But I mean, at first he seemed to fumble a little bit in terms of, what buttons to push to put the engine on and everything else. But he managed to pull it off. So the jet takes off, and then they need to, there's this little thing called radar that Diana, it's a cute moment, or Steve Trevor tells her that, don't worry, we're going to escape. I can fly. I'm a good flyer. But hey, there's radar. Wonder Woman cloaks it from radar by turning the plane invisible. But how does she have that power? How did she suddenly acquire this power to make things invisible? She mentioned when she was little, she made a little coffee cup disappear, but then she lost it and she could never find the coffee cup. It was actually an interesting and funny moment. It was a funny scene. I thought the dialogue was well. And I thought, again, Patty Jenkins, I think the way that this dialogue occurs in the movie, I think it's done well. But it's the fact that it's what's happening around. It's the plot itself that always seems to be a little bit difficult to reconcile. Now, but anyways, I went with it. Wonder Woman does make the plane invisible, and it does lead to a beautiful sequence of them in the plane. And in fact, it's even on the screen here. It's on the screen here to my right. And it's beautiful when they're watching fireworks because they can see through the invisible plane that Wonder Woman made invisible. It led to a beautiful scene, but her newfound power seemed a little bit sort of out of the blue. And um, now uh, uh, there was a couple of other elements of Wonder Woman's superpowers which sort of threw me for a little bit, and one of those was her flying ability. Wonder Woman in comic books has never been able to fly. She's been able to glide on air currents. Now, you might think I'm nitpicking here, but this was actually a distinction that's been repeatedly dealt with in the comic books for decades. And Wonder Woman has always been considered Wonder Woman's more like the bird. She glides on air currents. Wonder Woman has never been about speed in flight. She's not Superman, but she's fast, but she's more graceful and she glides like a bird. In this movie, there they the magic lasso was given the additional power to literally be able to rope the wind. I mean, literally roping wind. Now, again, that's obviously a godlike power. Wonder Woman has got the power that's grounded in the earth and grounded in Greek mythology. The idea of the original four elements: earth, wind, fire, etc., water. Her being able to rope the wind and literally fly for that reason, inspired by the words of Steve Trevor after she renounces her wish and he disappears. That that seemed really odd, and I think it made for some cool sequences, and but it wasn't quite as as powerful as it could be. In particular, when Wonder Woman first takes flight here and flies, it wasn't as effective or as impactful as when, let's say, in Man of Steel, when Henry Cavill as Superman, when he first learns to fly and he's smiling and everything else. That was a cool, epic scene, and it was really built up to. In Wonder Woman, it's leading into the third act. In Wonder Woman 1984, leading into that third act, Wonder Woman regains her powers after she renounces her wish, and throws her magic lasso into the air, ropes the wind, and it pulls her into the sky. And then she ropes a plane higher up, and then why did you need to rope the plane to pull you up higher into the sky when you could rope the wind again? And then she's higher in the sky, and then she ropes lightning. And it was fantastical and cool. At the same time, I don't know if it was really necessary for do that, and it provides it introduces new elements of Wonder Woman's power set that, in my view as a longtime comic book reader, it just wasn't necessary. But again, it was nice to see, and it was kind of cool, but it suffered in one respect, and one additional respect, and this is related to number two, that this movie felt like this movie was made in the 1980s. So it's one thing to say that this movie takes place in the 1980s, but this movie actually felt like it was made in the 1980s with respect to the special effects at times. You know what I mean? It seemed a little bit too campy at times, and it was almost as if it didn't learn some of the filmmaking lessons from the 1980s that we've sort of gone past. There was something about the special effects that, while it definitely had a unique feel, it did kind of have the original Superman the movie feel. It did sort of have a Christopher Reeve feel to it at times, and for that reason, it kind of worked. That contributed to the emotional impact and a feeling of nostalgia that I had, because I grew up in the 80s, so I like that part. But at the same time, I will admit that there was something missing with the special effects. There was something there. The flying was always a little bit off. It was jarring. She fit in the scene well. I mean, they obviously have great green screen effects and everything else, but something just felt a little bit off. But again, maybe I'm nitpicking here, but it still worked for me. But again, I can completely see why it didn't work for others. Now, number 5, the manner of Steve Trevor's return. This is something that's created some controversy, or at least some talk, and I want to address it because I think it's worth talking about. When Wonder Woman wishes Steve Trevor to return, when Steve Trevor returns, it's Steve Trevor's soul that returns in the body of another man. Now, much has been said that, well, Diana and Steve Trevor, they have intimate relations in this movie, or at least it's strongly implied. They wake up in bed together. And so much has been said, well, aren't you essentially raping the man whose body Steve Trevor's soul is in? And it seems to bother a lot of people. I'm a little bit surprised by that, because I can tell you that, maybe this is the lawyer side of me, but it's clearly not rape. If you think of it in terms of the soul, I would argue that it's literally this man's soul is not there anymore. It's replaced by Steve Trevor. So Steve Trevor is in fact in control of the body. So this consent is no longer relevant. Wherever the soul of this guy went, we don't know. That is a potential criticism. We don't know the body that Steve Trevor's soul took over. Where did that guy's soul, where did that guy's soul go? We don't know. He must have been in limbo somewhere, but we know that Steve Trevor's soul was in control of this body. So it was Steve Trevor that consented to it. Now, obviously, the guy had no choice. He was forcibly taken from his body, and where he ended up, we don't know. But I don't overthink that aspect of it. But one of the things that could have been addressed in the movie, there was a moment when Steve Trevor was looking, he's in this guy's apartment and he's looking around, and he can see that this guy has a family, and so can Diana. And they never once had a discussion about, well, is this right? I mean, what about this guy's life? It's not right that I'm replacing this man to spend the rest of my life with you, Diana, when this guy has a life that we've taken away. I've taken away this man's life by calling me back. Forget about the rest of the world. We've actually taken this man's body from him, depriving him of a body in which to have a life. That discussion wasn't had. It wasn't even, you could perhaps argue that it was implied and could be read into the movie, but it should have been a little bit more specific, because that was something that highlighted Diana's flaw of character as well, which on the one hand could be seen as a good thing, because Wonder Woman needs flaws. She's more interesting when she has flaws. And of course, Wonder Woman's primary flaw in this movie, which was a good thing, was that she too was greedy. She too was selfish. There was an open question at one point that was never answered when Steve Trevor posed a question suggesting, why did you, what motivated you to bring me back, Diana? Was it love and I guess it was like, maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was loneliness. If you make a wish out of desperation and loneliness, is it really something you need? Is it really something that's in your best interest? Even if it's wishing for your greatest love to return. There's that. There's also the point that this is 65 years later. And I'm going to deal with number one now. This plot does not move Wonder Woman as a franchise forward. The plot in this movie. This is 65 years after the end of World War I. World War I ended in 1919. That's when the first Wonder Woman movie ended. This is in 1984, 65 years later. And quite frankly, Wonder Woman is still pining over Steve Trevor. So she, as a character, she never moved past that pain in 65 years. That's a little bit insulting to the character, arguably. I mean, we all carry baggage with us. Wonder Woman is immortal, but 65 years is a long time to pine over a guy when you've got an entire planet filled with men, more than one of which I'm sure could compete with Steve Trevor, let's be blunt. Now, and the problem of that even goes farther, because we also know from the Justice League movie that Wonder Woman still isn't over Steve Trevor, even in 2016, 2007, 2017. So even at the end of this movie, we know that Wonder Woman still is pining for Steve Trevor. Still doesn't quite get over that loss. And yet this movie, in order to have some gravitas to contribute more to it, Wonder Woman ought to have learned that lesson. And I think this is part of the problem with Patty Jenkins. Patty Jenkins, I think, had it in her head that they really, really wanted Steve Trevor back. And I think one of the reasons why they needed Chris Pine back is that Chris Pine really carried this movie. Chris Pine carried the scenes that he was in with Gal Gadot. Chris Pine is an excellent actor. Gal Gadot, her acting got much better in the third act. She was really good. She really sold the pain and the suffering and her angst about having to give up Steve Trevor again. I thought she nailed it. I thought she did a good job, but she still has a ways to go. Chris Pine was needed in this movie, and I think out of desperation to get Chris Pine back as Steve Trevor, I think maybe they were a little bit loosey-goosey with the plot, as I've already described. Now, I said, I've actually mentioned twice there, you'll notice in points 1 and 4, the plot did not move Wonder Woman franchise forward. And the plot also does not move Wonder Woman herself forward. So they're similar, but I think they're similar, but they're not the same. This movie doesn't move the Wonder Woman franchise forward because Wonder Woman is still as a franchise, is sort of still locked in limbo. It's still not really establishing her in the modern era. So that's a criticism. And Wonder Woman as a character, as I stated in point number 1 here, Wonder Woman as a character doesn't really move a lot forward in terms of growing as a character. Now, is there anything else? I believe that covers most of the things that didn't work in this movie for me. Guys, you can let me know what you think. I welcome any comments that you might have. Did I miss any criticisms of this movie as a whole? Please let me know in the comments below. And until next time, guys, thank you so much for watching, and Comic Boom. Here we go. We're going to go with the out with Comic Boom. Out. Whoa.